Okay, so one of the topics this week is learning how to manage a camera and then deal with keeping the player where you want them and being able to see them without having objects get in the way. So I wanted to quickly demonstrate one setup that I've put together on Unity for you. So you'll be able to look at the scripts afterwards, and I'll talk about how I went through. When I go to play, you can see what I set up was dynamically changing the materials of objects that get in the way of the player. And there's a yellow line being drawn between the camera that I have control over, and then the player is just a cube on the other side of these three walls. So right now you can see it's already recognizing that there are objects in the way, and it sets the material of the three walls to be transparent. So each of them are about 1/3 of the opacity they would normally have. So just normally it would be full opacity and you wouldn't be able to see through it at all. So as they're layered over top of each other, it gets a bit more opaque. You could have a different setup for it depending on how much transparency you want. But otherwise, as I move out of the way, you can see that the objects that are no longer obstructing the player switch to have a material that's completely opaque. Okay, and it goes back when we have the walls get in the way again. It doesn't matter what position I'm in with the camera, or what angle I'm looking at with the camera. I mean, it's nice to be able to have something like this if you've got a game where you expect to have the camera move in between, or have objects move in between the camera and the player. So let me just stop that. I'm going to pause and give you a reference for someone that gave me just the basic idea, and then I went through and tried to program it myself. Okay, so this is a fellow that I see on Discord once in a while, and I'll switch it back to the beginning of his video. So his game is called Sketchy House Flipper. Yeah. You can tell that when the player is walking around in the environment that he's created, if walls get in the way at all, the similar thing happens with the demonstration I showed. So I guess it's not showing it in the video, it's just showing him getting beat up. I won't explain the concept of the game. You can look it up on Steam yourself, just by looking up the name of it. I'm not sure. It's supposed to be releasing next year, it looks like. But yeah, if the player is behind one of these walls, he does actually get at the geometry of the wall to change the material and make it transparent. So I just looked up the documentation in Unity, and let me bring each one at a time. So I looked up a lot of different stuff, but the ones that ended up being useful were Raycast all. So from the position of the camera, so the starting point, and then the direction, which I think you can give as separate. Yeah, so the origin I give as the starting point. So it's an overloaded function. So the position of the camera is the first parameter, and then the next parameter I gave the direction towards the player from the camera, which you can just calculate as the difference between their positions. And then the maximum distance, I just set it to be 200, but you could play around with that. Layer mask. This is useful when you know that if you're going to work with collisions, you can separate them into different layers. So that way you don't have to worry about everything colliding with everything else. You can only focus on just the two things that you want to check whether they're interacting or not. Trigger interaction. So I've got it set up to work with triggers, but I didn't seem to have to worry about passing in a parameter for that at all. Okay, so in the other spot, once you get a list of Raycast hits, or returns an array of these, what you do with a Raycast hit is you can check and keep track of the number of collisions or the number of colliders that the ray ends up intersecting with. So in the demonstration, you saw the yellow line that was being drawn. So when I'm moving around, you can see the line. It's intersecting with the walls. And so you can just get back the array of colliders. So that's the green geometry that has the same size as the objects. And you could change the geometry of the colliders themselves if you wanted them to be different from the geometry of the walls. But with that array, it's keeping track of the hits. So there would be 3 because there's 3 walls in the way of the player that I've got. I mean, I can go through and I can either pick out the colliders if I want to just work with those. And from the collider, I could also get the rigid body. Let me just turn the game off. You can just get the rigid body directly from the hit, which is, I think I did that. So if I show you my code now, I've got the same kind of controls for my Xbox controller to just move the camera around, and I cleaned it up a little bit. I'll show that after. But otherwise, if I want to set the walls to be transparent and then set them back again, within the regular update, I think I can get away with having it done in the update rather than the fixed update, because I really don't think you need to have the switch for the material be done as fast as physics. It's only something that people are going to observe as they play the game, and the only thing they can see are the frames that are being displayed. And it's not like you're moving the walls at all. So unless you're doing transparency and updating the materials for objects that are moving, I wouldn't worry about having it try to do this in the fixed update function for physics. Otherwise, I've got my hits array that I want to keep track of for my Raycast hit. And then how I get my array is I make the call to Raycast all, and I'm passing in the position of the camera. So this is a script that belongs to my camera object. And then I calculated the direction from the camera to the player. And that's pretty easy. You just take the player's position with using its transform and subtract off the position of the camera. So that gives me the direction to the player. And then I just pass the distance for how far I want my collision detection to hit with my ray to at most 200 units. And the layer mask, I'll discuss that a bit later. Once you get back the array of hits, you can check whether you have any with hits.length. So that's just C# notation. So capital L, I think that's kind of strange, but I'll get used to that from being different with Java and C++. Now, keep in mind that I'm tracking a number of objects that could possibly be in the way, and I'm thinking of them as layers. So in order to keep track of the difference when that changes, I've got a queue. So up at the top, I created a private, sorry, I keep on wanting to call it a cube, but it's a stack. Because it's very likely that as you move out of the way of stationary objects, that one by one, you're gonna have them move out of the way. So I think for now, this demonstrates how one way you could approach dealing with the problem, but I think otherwise you'd have to keep an array and then iterate through the array to check, because they could be going out of order of the stack. Okay, if there is a difference between the objects that are no longer in the way of the player, then I can update it by checking the difference between the stack and the hits that I get back. And if there is a difference, I'm gonna make the ones that are added on top of the stack. So I've got more objects getting in the way. I make them transparent and push them onto the stack. Otherwise, it's the other way around. And there's fewer hits than there are things that used to be in the way. So then I'm returning the objects to have, instead of transparent material, an opaque material. So I'm doing the opposite. So if the stack has more objects in it than the hits, I'm going to pop it off the stack and return them back to their original material with a full opaque 1.0 alpha value. Okay, notice that it's in a while loop. So I'm just gonna pop until the count matches with the number of hits. So that way I'm not making any changes for anything that's still in the way of the player. Okay, so it should switch back and forth, and you saw that in the demonstration between being transparent or opaque. And I've got a function that's changing the material. You've seen this before in a previous video. So I just made it its own function, so I don't have to write the same code over and over. Okay, so we just get the component for the renderer, changes color. And I did clean up the camera controller movement. So I created a struct, and in C#, it's a bit different than in C++. To create your own struct, you just use keyword struct. You don't have to use type define. I don't call it input with the full name because there already exists an object that's named input. So I just call it in. And then it's got the 4 different directions that I want to control with the movement of the camera. So horizontal, vertical, pan, and tilt. And then I created a variable that's private to the camera. Just named it lowercase I input. So now it just keeps it a bit more tidy. When I want to do anything with inputs, I can tell exactly what I'm going to do with those values. And I can read it quite a bit easier than what I had before. I'm not going to talk about the movement for position or rotation. I've already shown that before. I've just cleaned it up a bit more. Okay, lastly, I needed to control which collisions would interact with each other with a layer. In Unity, it's a bit weird with the layers. You select which one you want to work with when you pass it into a function by bit shifting. So I created an environment layer that in the editor has number 8. So if I select one of my walls here, each of them is on the environment layer that I created. And if you want to add your own layer, you've got ones that are available from number 8 and above that Unity does not reserve for itself. You can name them what you want. I have another layer for the camera itself. And then you can see I've also changed the layer for the camera. So in the inspector, after you create a layer, you have to go and set it for each object you want. And then inside project settings, you go to physics, and down at the bottom, you have the collision matrix. You can select which layers are allowed to interact with each other. So I have the environment and the camera layers. checked to interact with each other. Okay, I have the camera moving a bit slower in this setup than I had in the previous one that I showed you. So as far as the input, so if I do input manager, I only have the value for dead be 0.1. So that way I don't have to worry about it moving on its own and slowly shifting away, because I'm only multiplying by 10 now instead of 40. So I think last time I had it at 0.5 threshold. So that's a little details to consider with things. You get more familiar with it as you play around with it. So I encourage you to go in and read the documentation, try things out. One thing I would encourage you to try is setting up your own objects. And then instead of having a stack like this, just have an array that's keeping track of which things are currently, that used to be from previous hits when you cast a ray between your camera and the player. That way, if it changes, you can update things for the materials to either be opaque or transparent accordingly. Because if I did have things moving around in my game, then instead of just stationary walls like this, I'd have to change the data structure where I'm keeping track of previous hits. Okay, I hope that helps a little bit. I'm gonna have a lot of notes up for different effects you could have with a camera. And they should be straightforward calculations that you could do. And it's a really good GDC talk. I think that was given, probably at least 4 years ago. Otherwise, I think it's a lot of fun to play around with this kind of stuff. And I hope you and your groups are working together well and you're making progress on things. And I might have a couple more videos up. I don't think I'm going to have too much this week for some of the other topics.